From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. Our top story tonight is about the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine. COVID-19 vaccines are less effective against the coronavirus's Delta variant. That's according to results from one of the largest real-world studies into the efficacy of the shots. The study analyzed more than 3 million PCR COVID tests in the UK. The administration of President Joe Biden is recommending booster doses of the vaccine for most Americans who received a shot. This is in order to combat waning immunity and the prevalence of the Delta variant. In a joint statement Wednesday, top administration health officials said people would need boosters beginning 8 months after their second dose of either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. Anthony Fauci, the country's leading infectious disease expert, pointed to studies showing significant drops in vaccine protection over time. Figures released by the Mayo Clinic showed that effectiveness against the Delta variant slid from 76 to 42% with Pfizer's vaccine and 86 to 76% with Moderna's. But Fauci says a booster dose would increase the antibody levels in COVID vaccines tenfold. To get more people vaccinated, President Biden announced a new initiative on Wednesday. He is ordering the Department of Health and Human Services to require nursing homes to have vaccinated staff. This would be mandatory if they want to participate in Medicare and Medicaid, as well as receive funding from federal programs. This will be the first time the federal government has implemented any type of vaccination requirement besides those for federal government employees. President Biden explained that although over 130,000 residents in nursing homes have passed away from COVID, vaccination among nursing home staff significantly trails the rest of the country. The World Health Organization is calling the push for COVID booster shots vaccine injustice and a shame on all humanity. WHO Director General Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus said in a statement that the divide between the haves and have-nots will only grow larger if manufacturers and leaders prioritize booster shots over supply to low and middle-income countries. He called for countries to fully commit to vaccine equity and global solidarity, which would save lives and slow variants down. Earlier this month, Ghebreyesus called for a temporary moratorium on vaccine boosters. This was to free up supply for the dozens of low-income nations that have vaccinated less than 10% of their populations. But the U.S., Germany, and other wealthy countries currently moving forward with booster campaigns were quick to dismiss the call for a moratorium on the shots. After several hours of negotiating, a standoff between police and a bomb threat suspect in Washington, D.C. ended this morning. This was after the suspect, Floyd Roy Roseberry of Glover, North Carolina, surrendered, according to the Associated Press. Roseberry drove a pickup truck onto the sidewalk in front of the Library of Congress at 9:15 this morning. He claimed he had a bomb and displayed what looked like a detonator to an officer on the scene, according to U.S. Capitol Police Chief Tom Manger. The active bomb threat investigation prompted the evacuation of several buildings in D.C. This included the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court, and Cannon House Congressional Office building. Meanwhile, in New York, an all-clear was issued after Times Square was evacuated due to the presence of a suspicious container. U.S. President Joe Biden said his troops will remain in Afghanistan until all Americans leave the country, even if it takes longer than his August 31st deadline to withdraw. According to the original agreement, the U.S. was expected to withdraw in May this year. Afghanistan's airport operations have become more orderly as thousands of Afghans and foreigners are still attempting to flee the country. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said there have been no hostile interactions with the Taliban, and the lines of communication with Taliban commanders remain open. President Biden, defending his actions, told ABC News that he believed it would have been impossible to leave Afghanistan without chaos ensuing.
All troops are supposed to be out by August 31st. Even if Americans and our Afghan allies are still trying to get out, they're going to leave?
We're going to do everything in our power to get all Americans out and our allies out.
Does that mean troops will stay beyond August 31st if necessary?
It depends on where we are and whether we can ramp these numbers up to 5,000 to 7,000 a day coming out. If that's the case, they'll all be out.
Meanwhile, in the United Arab Emirates, ousted President of Afghanistan Ashraf Ghani said he supported negotiations between the Taliban and former top officials. Ghani fled the country as the Taliban closed in on the capital Kabul last week. He said he was in his own talks to return home. But U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said Ghani was no longer a figure on the country's complex political stage. In related news, parents of an Afghan teenager who died trying to flee Afghanistan said they did not know that their son had gone to the airport. They say rumors that America was taking 20,000 people to the U.S. are encouraging everyone to get out, even if they have not worked for the United States. The Taliban have arrested 2 of their fighters for the murder of a comedian. Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid confirmed that the 2 men who murdered Nazar Muhammad are members of the Taliban, according to ABC News. Earlier, a video that went viral on social media showed 2 men torturing and later killing an Afghan comic and blogger known as Nazar Muhammad. The killing took place amid instability surging in the country, reportedly as a result of the departure of U.S. forces. Mujahid said the offenders had been arrested and now await trial. He also claimed that the dead comedian was a member of Afghanistan's national police and had been implicated in the torture and execution of members of the Taliban. Mujahid stressed that Muhammad was to have been prosecuted, not killed. The Taliban have promised to improve Afghanistan's economy, but they have no money to run the country at the moment. The U.S. has frozen Afghan Central Bank's $9.5 billion, and the International Monetary Fund has denied access to $450 million. Vanda Felbab-Brown is an Afghanistan specialist at the Brookings Institution. She says Afghanistan is tremendously dependent on foreign aid and international economic aid. She also stressed that access to international economic funds will be crucial for the nation. Foreign aid is about 10 times or even more than what the Taliban has been able to obtain. In 2020, aid flows represented over 42% of Afghanistan's $19.8 billion GDP, according to World Bank data. The country still does not have a government and needs urgent funds right now, according to UN agencies. Here is Mary Ellen McGroarty of the World Food Programme.
The conflict has combined with drought and the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 to push an already dire situation closer to a catastrophe.
There are about 500,000 displaced people in Afghanistan who need urgent help.
In the past weeks, tens of thousands have fled their homes. Currently, the overwhelming majority of displacement is taking place within Afghanistan itself. That's where humanitarian efforts also need to be focused. Over 500,000 people have been displaced within the country since the beginning of the year. Acute humanitarian needs are now spiraling. 80% of those forced to flee within the country are women and children.
Brown University's Costs of War project has found that the U.S. spent $2.26 trillion for the war in Afghanistan from the fall of 2001 through the fiscal year that ends in September. However, recent numbers relating to the human toll of the conflict remain unavailable. In the first 10 years of the American-led war on terror, from 2001 to 2011, 1.3 million lives were lost in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. This is according to research by Physicians for Social Responsibility, Physicians for Global Survival, and the Nobel Prize-winning International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Lieutenant Colonel James Cho is a former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer who is now a Defense Council member of the Truman National Security Project. He told the UK's Guardian newspaper that he was torn, sad, and angry at the turn of events in Afghanistan. He says this is because he witnessed the untold sacrifices of amazing men and women and now struggles with whether any of it mattered. But others in the U.S. continued to express support for the U.S. withdrawal and pushed for more support for Afghanistan. The Congressional Progressive Caucus on Tuesday pressed the Biden administration to engage in diplomacy with the emerging Taliban government. It also called for providing as much humanitarian aid as possible to the countless civilians devastated by the past 2 decades of war. The caucus condemned U.S. military action in Afghanistan as an abject and deadly failure. This comes as President Joe Biden's administration faces criticism from Republicans and members of his own party over how the exit has unfolded. The United National Anti-War Coalition, or UNAC, has questioned America's original motives for the war that began with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. It says that the Taliban government at the time was ready to turn Osama bin Laden over to an international court if shown proof of his involvement in the 9/11 attacks. But rather than do that, UNAC said the U.S. attacked and occupied the country and turned the government over to a group of warlords. 3 former Philadelphia homicide detectives have been charged in the wrongful 1993 conviction of Anthony Wright. Wright is an African-American father who spent 25 years in prison on rape and murder charges. The 3 former police officers are accused of making false statements in the case. Wright was exonerated by DNA evidence after a retrial in 2016. According to the report Exonerations 2016, African-American prisoners who were convicted of murder are about 50% more likely to be innocent than other convicted murderers. They also spend more time in prison before exoneration. Usman Khan Alimov, Uzbekistan's Grand Mufti, has died of complications caused by COVID-19 in a Moscow hospital. He was 71 years old. According to doctors, Alimov died of heart complications caused by COVID. Mufti Alimov was buried in his native Samarkand region in southeast Uzbekistan on August 16th. Uzbekistan is one of the Turkic countries that was occupied by the former Soviet Union until 1991. 93% of Uzbekistan's 33 million people are Muslim. The FBI has arrested Logan Barnhart. The 40-year-old bodybuilder from Michigan was photographed dragging a police officer down a set of stairs. This was during the siege of Capitol Hill on January 6th by a mob of supporters of former President Donald Trump. The FBI says Barnhart faces multiple charges, including assaulting federal officers with a dangerous weapon. Ronald Colton McAbee of Unionville, Tennessee, was also arrested and charged with federal offenses. These include assaulting, resisting, or impeding officers using a dangerous weapon and inflicting bodily injury. More than 2,000 were killed in an earthquake in Haiti. Survivors are still in need of food and medical care. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
These images are showing the devastating situation in Haiti after being hit by the 7.2 magnitude earthquake. Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry says that his country is on its knees after more than 2,000 people were killed. Statistics also show the total number of injured is raised to more than 12,000 people, whereas 332 are still missing. Haitian officials estimate more than 500,000 people in need of emergency assistance. UNICEF says about 500,000 children have limited or no access to shelter, safe water, and food. These images show survivors building makeshift tents at a football stadium. Heavy rains this week have further made relief difficult. Armed gangs just added insult to injury. They attacked aid convoys traveling to the worst-hit areas. Anger is growing in many remote areas where aid has yet to arrive. U.S. aid agency USAID said that many roads remained impassable. According to BBC, the United Nations said following negotiations, the gangs had agreed to let the aid through. Haiti has been hit by a series of natural disasters in the past, including Hurricane Matthew in 2016. The worst hit was the 2010 earthquake, which caused massive damage to the country's infrastructure and economy, and killed more than 200,000 people.
Imam Hussein continues to inspire millions of Muslims to seek justice by standing up to tyranny. May God be pleased with him. At the 10th of Muharram, Muslims commemorate his martyrdom. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saliha Farouk.
Muslims around the world mark the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and his followers on the 10th of Muharram. They commemorate his struggle against a tyrannical ruler Yazid. Imam Hussein is the grandson of the Prophet. His mother, Fatima, is Prophet Muhammad's daughter. And his father is the Prophet's cousin and the fourth Caliph of Islam. May Allah be pleased with them all. Yazid was appointed as the leader of Muslims by his father, therefore turning Muslim leadership into a personal inheritance. Imam Hussein declined to submit to this rule. It meant sacrificing his life. When the people of Kufa promised to join his struggle against tyranny, he traveled there. Kufa is in today's Iraq. His caravan was intercepted near Karbala by Yazid's army. He was killed in the Battle of Karbala on the 10th of Muharram 680 by Yazid's army. Most of his family, including his 6-month-old son, Ali al-Asghar, were also murdered. The rest of his children and family were taken as prisoners. Muslim anger at Hussein's death became a rallying cry that helped undermine the Umayyad Caliphate's legitimacy. Ultimately, their rule was overthrown by the Abbasid. Sunnis and Shias both love Imam Hussein and honor his struggle against tyranny. Shia Muslims consider him to be their third Imam. His sacrifice continues to inspire Muslims worldwide who hold him up as an exemplar who upheld what is right over what is popular.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. The humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Afghanistan, and there is a huge number of Afghan refugees who need the attention of the world community. In one of our previous in-depth analyses, we discussed the situation of refugees around the world. Let's watch.
Thank you. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Dr. James Hathaway, who is the director of the Refugee and Asylum Law Program at the University of Michigan. Dr. James Hathaway, thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Now, I wanted to begin first with a really fascinating report that you had published called The Global Cop-Out on Refugees. And this report, of course, explored many things, but namely the difficulties of international governments to safeguard refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, as well as proposed solutions and recommendations. And I just wanted to get a feel of what had led you to write that report and what kind of solutions or recommendations came out of it.
So there was a major United Nations initiative a couple of years ago that led to what's called the Global Compact on Refugees. By the way, look at the framing of that. The Global Compact on refugees, not for refugees. And that actually tells you everything you need to know. The governments of the world basically agreed to some vague principles that could be rolled out in the event of a major refugee movement, but committed themselves to absolutely nothing. And so we ended up in a situation where now we've got 85% of the world's refugees stuck in poor countries with no support from wealthy countries, where we have those same small number of wealthy countries spending 4 times as much to look after the tiny 15% of refugees they receive as the rest of the world gets for the 85%. And my article really was trying to explain why the United Nations had effectively done a cop-out on refugees. It had not actually offered anything that would provide a solution to the dilemmas we have. I mean, the critical point right now is that more than half of the world's refugee population, millions of refugees, have been waiting more than 20 years, stuck in camps or other hellholes, waiting for a solution with none in sight. And this new proposal from the UN offered absolutely nothing that was guaranteed to fix that. And I thought it was time that we said that out loud.
Now, when speaking about the United Nations, the UNHCR recently argued that refugees do require international support, but they have a hard time accessing it because of difficult as well as controversial policies in such majoritarian countries. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, but again, think back to it, right? The problem is there's no system to share burdens, meaning money, and responsibilities, meaning people, under the current system. So if you don't want refugees, what you do is you put up barriers to stop them from entering. As soon as they enter, they're 100% your responsibility. So that's an inevitable result of a system that is poorly designed. If you had actually done what my team had proposed, namely to move from a one by one individual state system to a global system where we share burdens and responsibilities, then the place that you arrive might not be the place where you're protected. Everybody would have a duty to fund it, and there would be no incentive to close the doors. So if UNHCR is concerned, as it should be, about the fact that many countries are not living up to their obligations, they needed to offer a real binding mechanism to fix that, instead of a lot of vague principles that nobody is obliged to do anything about.
Some great insight there. I wanted to take the conversation to governments, as you mentioned. Now, the Biden administration has recently boosted the refugee cap to approximately 62,000 refugee admissions this year, and he's expressed wishes to boost it further to approximately 125,000. In your professional opinion, how would this impact any pitfalls in the current migration and asylum system in the United States? And you are a professor at the University of Michigan.
So look, increasing resettlement is really wonderful for the human beings involved. There's no question about that. And again, keep in mind what I'm saying. There have been more than 13 million refugees waiting for a solution for an average of 20 years. So any number is good. The problem, though, is that in any given year, even with these new American numbers, less than 1% of the protracted refugee population gets a solution. So it's a great thing for the human beings involved. I do not wish to caricature that, but it doesn't come anywhere close to a solution to the dilemma of protection. 99% plus of refugees are still going to be stuck in difficult situations, and this won't fix that.
Now, going back to the UNHCR, they do report that approximately 82 million people are displaced globally, according to this UN body. Let's talk about the coronavirus. That's something that's affecting minorities all around the world. How are refugees, however, particularly and disproportionately exposed to either COVID, and as well as how would this affect their resettlement plans and the trajectory of their journey, essentially?
So I need to take you back one point, right? The 82 million number is not accurate. The 82 million number that the UNHCR puts forward is designed to inflate the extent of both their responsibilities and what they would characterize as the problem. Of the 82 million, 48 million are people who are still inside their own country, and they're effectively internal human rights victims. The total number of refugees is around 25 million, including people claiming refugee status, and that number has been pretty stable for a long time. So there is actually no global refugee crisis. There is a protection crisis, which means that there isn't a mechanism to respond to those numbers, but the numbers are not growing significantly. And the inflated numbers that have been put out really do not give a fair picture of the number of people crossing borders looking for protection at all. The COVID era has simply intensified what was already there, in my view. States were already disinclined to admit refugees. Again, if somebody who arrives at your border is 100% your responsibility, and no other countries, no matter how rich, no matter how powerful, owe you anything, you have an incentive to say no. And so that incentive was already there. And we saw it not only in rich countries, but also an increasing number of middle income and poorer countries that are closing the doors to refugees. COVID intensified that. It gave countries a pretext to say no that seemed to be more legitimate than what they had been saying previously, which was simply that they didn't want them. But honestly, I don't think it fundamentally changed the nature of the dilemma. The dilemma is that if you want at-risk persecuted people to have a place to go safely, you need a system that treats both the refugees and the predominantly poor countries to which they flee in a way that is fair. And we do not have that now, which is why doors are closing.
We often hear about this concept of responsibility to protect, as well as the global responsibility or legal obligations for countries to abide by the Refugee Convention. What impact do these such international legal responsibilities and refugee conventions have on countries, and what is stopping global governance from perhaps coming in and changing those structural issues that you mentioned?
I think it's two words: political will. That's it. I mean, there is nothing wrong with the Refugee Convention. I mean, there is one thing wrong with it that I'll mention briefly, which is important. It structurally excludes 6 million Palestinian refugees. It is a racist exclusion that treats Palestinians as non-refugees under the UN Refugee Treaty. That, I think, is pretty fundamental. Aside from that one racist exclusion, the definition of refugees as persecuted people because of who they are or what they believe, and the rights that they get under the treaty, rights to enter, to start businesses, to educate their children, etc., are perfectly sensible and workable. So there is nothing wrong, in my view, with the treaty. The normative vehicle is more than adequate to respond to the challenges of today. What is hideously wrong, though, are the mechanisms to implement it. If we don't have a system that actually dependably enables people to get access to protection, that shares out the responsibility to protect, that fairly apportions the financial burdens of protection, that gives governments that open their doors to refugees a clear basis to understand that other countries farther away will take on their share of that responsibility, then it's destined to fail. And that's where we are right now.
We touched upon how certain factors such as COVID are currently exacerbating the refugee crisis. If we could just highlight a few other factors and get your take on that. So, for example, we seldom hear about people, or refugees rather, drowning in the Mediterranean. But for example, just this year, approximately 815 people have died trying to cross that journey, according to the IOM. If you could talk to us about the potential for human loss during this journey and how such factors, including maybe trafficking, can play a role in this trajectory.
So if you want to eliminate the market for traffickers, let people come. Don't put up barriers. The traffickers only have a market because countries have put up walls that preclude people from asking for asylum in a fair way. There would be no reason to mortgage your future to a trafficker if you could fairly and reasonably walk up to the door and submit your asylum claim. That's not the reality right now. And in fact, as you allude in your question, in the Mediterranean, it's much worse than that. the European Union is actually training and funding the Libyan Navy to go out and intercept people and lock them up in hideous torture chambers. Now, that's not simply not welcoming them. That is taking affirmative negative steps that breach law. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has, in my view, tragically been very quiet about that phenomenon. You say we haven't heard much about it, but the honest truth is those of us in the refugee world have been frenetically trying to put this issue front and forward for years now. It used to be the United States and the Caribbean doing this with Haitians. It's the European Union and the Australians and others who are at the forefront of extraterritorial deterrence right now. They're doing illegal things in spaces that they believe they won't be caught. And again, until we have a system that gives them an incentive to play within the rules, because it's managed and organized and not simply about avoiding responsibility, this is tragically logical behavior if they can get away with it. And they are right now.
Now, you mentioned Palestinians being excluded from the Refugee Convention. Just bringing me to my next point here, more than 2/3 of all refugees stem from just around 5 countries, all of which are in Asia. If you can talk to us about the one outlier right now being Venezuela and its refugee and migration crisis, and also Venezuela has been trending in the news for the past few weeks as well.
Yeah, look, so I don't think there's anything particularly special about the Venezuelan situation in legal terms. I mean, the UNHCR has a hard time classifying them. They don't call them refugees, but they just call them Venezuelans in their statistics, which seems very odd to me. By and large, they're fleeing a situation of endemic human rights abuse that the state is unwilling or unable to respond to. And that's a classic definition of a refugee, particularly in Latin America as in Africa, where there is an extended regional definition of status. So there was no need to equivocate about the fact that this is effectively a failed state. Venezuela is a failed state, but so too, if we look at Syria, we look at Myanmar, we look at Afghanistan, we look at South Sudan, the other top countries producing refugees, they are all failed states. They are states that are not doing their basic job. And ironically, that's exactly the group for whom refugee law was created. Refugee law was created to let people move to another country to live in safety when their own country couldn't or wouldn't do its basic job. So go down that list: Syria, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Venezuela, South Sudan. The top 5 countries producing 2/3 of the world's refugees are all in the failed state category.
Dr. James Hathaway is the director of the Refugee and Asylum Law Program at the University of Michigan. Dr. James, thank you so much for your important insights today and your time for being with us.
Thank you.
Back to Hina Zubairi in the news studio.
Thank you, Salha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now.
and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. In one of our segments, we covered the news of a Taliban delegation visiting China before the complete takeover in Afghanistan. We also discussed the role of Pakistan. Let's take a look.
Taliban were recently in China meeting with the Chinese foreign ministers. While they were just done with their conversation, Secretary of State from the United States flew to India talking with their foreign minister. All about Afghanistan. Where is Pakistan in all of this? To discuss with us is a scholar from Pakistan, Professor Junaid Ahmed. He is director for the Center of Global Dialogue in Lahore, Pakistan, and is with the Lahore University of Management Sciences. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Assalamu alaikum, Imam. It's wonderful to be here.
Wa alaikum salam. So what's your assessment of current situation in Afghanistan?
Well, my assessment is probably very similar to the Prime Minister Imran Khan's, which is a very straightforward one, which is the situation now is somewhat unpredictable, although we see obviously over the past few months the signs of the ascendancy of the Taliban taking over district after district after district, so that roughly about half the country, if not more, is now under Taliban control. But the larger assessment is one that, of course, was articulated not just by Prime Minister Imran Khan very candidly, as you said, perhaps rubbing it in the face, but I don't think that was the intention. I think the intention right now is to give an overall assessment, not just of what's happening right now, but also how we got here. And I think that is a view shared by, of course, many analysts who understand what's been going on, who understand Afghanistan, and particularly since the U.S.-NATO invasion in November 2001. And that is that there was never going to be a military solution to this. Whether the aims and objectives were noble or not noble, regardless of that, a military solution at its peak, and we should remember, there were close to 150,000 U.S. NATO forces. Now that couldn't do the trick, and I don't think anything would have done the trick. And so this is the point that Prime Minister Imran Khan was trying to emphasize, because he's constantly asked, and the one thing that he, as opposed to so many other politicians certainly in Pakistan, is that he's been very consistent about this. To the chagrin of many, even within the Pakistani establishment and the political class, that this war on terror was always going to lead to more and more complications, to more violence in the region, and its spillover effects within Pakistan. And I think that assessment has proven to be true. And I think that the United States, sadly, after spending trillions of dollars, untold casualties, has realized that now, and this is why you see this very awkward type of, I say awkward because it's without any significant planning, understanding with even the Afghan government that is its ally and that it supports. It has kind of picked up its bags and running, and slowly the withdrawal will be complete, not having an understanding of kind of what will ensue, and giving these kind of schizophrenic responses that, on the one hand, you mentioned Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in India, on the one hand saying that it's a positive sign that these Taliban forces are being engaged and being considered as a significant political force. On the other hand, also saying that, well, if they come to power, it will be a pariah state. And obviously, at the same time, we also know that the U.S. continues to conduct airstrikes within Afghanistan. So this type of schizophrenic response to the developments right now is an outcome, I think, of the incredibly confused and detrimental overall policy that the U.S. has engaged in Afghanistan since 2001.
Afghan government seems to still expect Pakistan to do for Afghanistan what America has failed to do. what type of leverage Pakistan has on Taliban?
Yes, I think that this is the biggest misconception, certainly propagated by, in the past. In the past, it was a very, almost very offensive, very insulting, accusatory tone. For most of the so-called war on terror since 2001 against Pakistan, that in fact it was not the U.S. NATO occupation, it was not the arrogance of that occupation, it was not the corruption and incompetence of this government in Kabul, of the former Northern Alliance members. It was none of that, and how the population was feeling so incredibly disenfranchised, marginalized, and insulted and humiliated by many night raids and so on, drone attacks, air strikes. But it was simply Pakistan's harboring and sheltering of a variety of kind of Taliban outfits, the Haqqani network. That was the cause of why this U.S. NATO occupation was failing miserably in Afghanistan. And I think that most serious observers, not those with some type of ideological and propagandistic agenda, most serious observers will understand that's ridiculous. That in fact, one can argue that, of course, in the 1990s, there was the Taliban force, which were Taliban. Our listeners and viewers should know. These are students. These were students, many of them orphan children, that had come across the border and studied in the madrasas in Pakistan. So they were. It's a band of students that had come in Afghanistan in the first place. And at that point, not to say that everyone agreed with the Taliban's ideological perspective, but we have to understand, and this is what we forget, that this is a country that has now been in no less than 4 decades of non-stop war. First under the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, following that the intra-Mujahideen conflict and violence that ensued. After that, the Taliban versus the Northern Alliance. And then, of course, after 2001, the U.S. NATO occupation. So this is a war-ravaged society for many, many decades. And at that point, yes, certainly in the 1990s, Pakistan was very clearly supporting the Taliban. And at the same time, it should be remembered that at that point, from 94 through 96, the period in which the warlords in Kabul engaged in mass killings, mass rapes, what Human Rights Watch called the worst period in Afghan history, 94 to 96. At that point, the Taliban were welcomed in the sense that they would bring about some type of law and order in this very violent society. At this stage, it is directly attributable, and I think this is an important point, that we often think of the Taliban as being this kind of ideological movement of kind of some very extremist interpretation of religion and that sort of thing. I think that this misses the point entirely. What ensued in terms of the resistance in Afghanistan starting 2002, 2003 was not simply this ideological movement. In fact, what the Taliban has been for many, many years, I think a much more accurate description would be the ethnic Pashtun resistance to foreign occupation, which has now, of course, over the years, has not been just the Pashtun population. It has incorporated many of the other ethnic groups within Afghanistan as well. So I think that this is not very useful in understanding what has unfolded, to just call it this kind of extreme ideological position of a group.
So you mentioned that they have incorporated non-Pashtun groups. So that seems like a development. How are they able to do that?
Well, one of the ways is of course what we see now. What we started off the conversation with this visit to Beijing. Well, actually, the actual city of Xinjiang. But it is part of the larger political and diplomatic offensive that the Taliban have been engaged in now for many, many years. We just know about the Doha diplomatic type of meetings that have been going on for many, many years, and in some ways which have resulted in nothing much. So the Taliban, as well as, by the way, the Afghan government, have understood that actually doing outreach to many of those countries that, of course, have been supportive of the enemies of the Taliban, the various warlords in the Northern Alliance, whether it be in Iran, which is, of course, always had close relations with the Hazara Shia in Afghanistan, whether it's in Moscow, where they had also gone, and now, of course, in Beijing. One of the things that the Taliban have tried to convey is that this is not going to be, or at least they don't want this to be, kind of a war till the end in which they just take over the country. That in fact they want to engage in something very different, which will be not of novelty for them, an inclusive type of setup, a political settlement, and so on. The problem is, of course, the intra-power play within Afghanistan is so delicate right now within the Ashraf Ghani government, President Ashraf Ghani, who still is just complaining about the U.S. leaving and is dead set against any kind of settlement with the Taliban. So I think that for a while now, that the Taliban have not only been engaged in this diplomatic offensive outside, but internally, getting people from the Hazara, getting people from the Tajik, Uzbek people, telling them that, look, this is going to be we want this to be a different situation in which all of these other ethnic groups are also included. And now they do have commanders from the different ethnic groups.
How Taliban are able to make major victory moves despite very large Afghan army, which is better supplied and better equipped, it seems, and better trained, at least when you look at Afghan army, they seems like soldiers on the street of Chicago during the Black Lives Matter, well equipped, all loaded up. And you see Taliban, they're still going around with shalwar kameez. So how Taliban are able to defeat Afghan army, which is trained for so long, in 20 years?
Well, Imam, this has been the story in I think of the entire Afghan venture, in the sense that what to many people will strike as just remarkable, unbelievable. For those of us who understand this type of guerrilla insurgency warfare, it's very non-conventional, and you're absolutely right. These individuals from the mountains and their shalwar kameez and their chappals and their just sandals and so on, how they have been able to sustain this resistance against, obviously, a government supported by the most powerful military forces in the world. And I think that it's a fundamental mistake to kind of understand it in this kind of conventional military technological warfare, and to understand the Taliban as in the history of all forms of kind of guerrilla warfare against some type of occupying power. Same thing you can say not only in Iraq, but the history is a long history from Vietnam and so on. So I think that has been the mistake. It's a mistake to think that the Taliban were just going to stand there and confront directly American military, the Afghan military supported by the American military. It has always been this type of a guerrilla insurgency. And I think that this is what has been the failure to understand, that how to confront this type of an insurgency, rather than seeing that, okay, it's not a conventional military, or that that's how we're going to subdue it. And that hasn't worked. And I think that right now, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Taliban still have, in terms of the ideology of resistance, and that is very popular amongst people who are so dissatisfied by the government and by the foreign occupation of these now 2 decades. The Taliban, the Afghan security forces, just like in Iraq, the late Robert Fisk and, of course, Patrick Coburn has spoken about these ghost units of the military, in which they're just trying to earn a paycheck. They never really believed in anything. And so when the Taliban is coming with some type of fervor in its military battles, the Afghan security forces, just like many in the Iraqi security units, they don't fight. So this is also what's going on in Afghanistan.
So tell me this, Pakistan had a major problem with Pakistani Taliban. If Afghanistan is under the control of Taliban, do you expect Pakistani Taliban to rise again and Pakistan goes through the same nightmare which it went through?
No, I don't. And I think that this is what Prime Minister Imran Khan and others, of course, as well, who understand this, keep on emphasizing, that only by continuing some type of outside military approach to this internal conflict within Afghanistan, any type of outside interference, which of course now this is the whole a thrust of the Chinese welcoming the Taliban and just recognizing them as a significant political player, not recognizing them as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. It is and emphasizing that this is ultimately they can facilitate some type of intra-peace agreement, but they're not going to interfere. I think this is the lesson that they're trying to teach, and hoping that the United States and other countries learn as well. It cannot be imposed from outside. When you attempt to do that, you then have the result, which of course Pakistan will feel the most because it's a neighboring country, and that was the spillover effect of Afghanistan into Pakistan, and you saw this period of spate of suicide bombings, etc., and people claiming to be the new Pakistani Taliban, which we must remember, many of their horrendous actions, the Afghan Taliban distanced themselves from. They condemned many of those actions. For example, the Peshawar bombing of the school bombing of the school children. The Afghan Taliban denounced that. So it's also important to remember these are not the same. These are not the same, and I think we make a mistake when we do that. So if these are not the same Taliban as 20, 25 years ago, what has changed? Are they going to come again and block women education and kick girls out of school? Well, look, I mean, this is right now speculation. This is also, in some ways, taking the Taliban on their word right now and seeing whether they actually mean it. So, of course, they have put out many statements. They wrote a very famous piece for the New York Times in which they said that, look, particularly on these points that we are very justifiably concerned, for example, female education, other domestic kind of policy that they would have on a whole front of other issues. They have made it very clear there, and even we see right now the districts they're taking over. One of the things they're doing is these schools, they're not closing down schools, both for boys and females. They're just putting a new headmaster there, a principal, and so on. So this is up for speculation. But the one thing that we do know is that this new what the British intelligence, the neo-Taliban, what they call, certainly for pragmatic realpolitik, if they have any chance of being part of some type of political settlement in which they are a stakeholder in the new Afghan political setup, they will have to make a lot of pragmatic concessions on a number of things on which they were previously justifiably criticized for. I think that this is going to be the real impetus for them to evolve and accept many different changes from what they used to implement in the past. To share this with me, please, that Pakistan and India has competed over Afghanistan to influence in many ways. Sometime the government, even before 40-year war, sometime it will be favorable, sometime in oppose and all that. Now that Taliban are flying all over Doha and Russia and Qatar and Turkey and all of that, does Pakistan have any leverage or relationship to counterbalance Indian interest and investment in Afghanistan? Oh, I think that right now more than ever. I mean, again, going back to this constant mantra about Pakistan, the Taliban and this resistance in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades being directly the result of some type of Pakistani support. I think that's a bogus claim. I think at maximum, certainly one can concede that many of these fighters would go across the border. But of course, we must remember this is not an easily controllable border. It has always been a porous border. We must remember that about two-thirds of the global of the Pashtun population, which is on both sides of the border, are in Afghanistan. Are in Pakistan. 1/3 of them are in Afghanistan. So this has always been a porous border, tribal, family connections on both sides. So Pakistan has obviously always had some relationship with this, going back many obviously years and decades, with the Taliban and the ethnic Pashtun resistance within Afghanistan. And it is precisely that kind of goodwill that they've had that brought the Taliban to the table in the first place. In Doha, particularly, the Doha negotiations with the United States, the attempt to also bring the Afghan government, which has been resistant to that. So they have that, and this is what the Prime Minister has articulated, Imran Khan has articulated, that it is precisely the Pakistanis' attempt to bring them to the negotiating table. But they also, the point to remember that he emphasized, that this would have worked out much better had it been when the U.S. NATO occupying troops were nearing about 150,000 in Afghanistan. Now that they are withdrawing and the Taliban clearly are on the ascendancy, it's very difficult, whether it's the Taliban or any type of military and political force, to get them to the negotiating table when they're winning anyways. So it is going to still be, I mean, I agree with you that it's going to still be the Pakistani goodwill and friendly pressure that will still try to bring Taliban to some type of a political solution, with clearly an Afghan government which is collapsing day by day.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Junaid Ahmed.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.